Welcome to Vintage NDEs, a channel that explores documented but unknown near-death experiences and other spiritual phenomenon from over 90 years ago. We know now that near-death experiences have been happening throughout time, but finding first-hand accounts on the subject before the mid-20th century proves to be challenging. I know of only 2 studies on the subject from the 18th and 19th centuries, both of which were not originally printed in English. In fact, I've been unable to locate either of these studies in any language. Even the term near-death experiences hadn't entered the public lexicon until 1975, when Dr. Raymond Moody published his book, Life After Life. Since that time, the subject has continued to grow in popularity, with thousands of people having come forward to share their stories. Today, there are an endless number of books and videos on this phenomenon. Naturally, all of these stories are modern, but what about accounts much older? Would they be similar to today's NDEs? Failing to find any old books or literature on the subject, I turned to old newspapers, hoping someone's story would be recorded. Scouring millions of American newspapers, I found some really interesting articles, many of which were published in surprising detail. I will now present you with what I've found. With the ephemeral nature of newspaper, you can be sure we are the first people to hear these stories since that time. When I'm able, I will provide context and biographical information about the individuals involved. I will try to upload a video at least once a week, so make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell.
This first story comes to us from the Leon Reporter, dated Thursday, January 5, 1911. Clark County man tells of miracle. Mark Fitzgerald says Lord healed him. The little town of Truro, just across the line in Madison County, Iowa, is very much worked up over the case of Mark Fitzgerald, who claims that he was raised from a sick bed after his spirit had left the body and made a visit to the very gates of heaven. Mr. Fitzgerald is a prosperous farmer, about 35 years of age, and a few weeks ago was lying at the point of death after an illness of several weeks from a complication of diseases. His son and brother was summoned, and it was feared that he would not live to see them. He said that he actually died, or at least his spirit visited heaven, and that he saw and conversed with members of his family long ago dead, and that the Lord told him not to touch them as he was yet unclean. He says he told the Lord that if he was permitted to return to earth, he would devote the rest of his life to the interests of humanity. The next morning he arose and, to the utter amazement of his family, dressed himself and appeared well and strong. He says he is completely cured and expects to sell off his stock and devote the rest of his years to religious work. On the evening of the 18th, Sunday, he spoke to his friends and neighbors upon his experience in the church at Truro. The Osceola Sentinel called up some of the local businessmen, and they tell us that his story is generally accepted and that the most skeptical do not doubt that he is sincere in his statements. The case has attracted much attention.
Here are a couple other articles about Mr. Fitzgerald I was able to locate. This one comes from Evening Times Republican, dated January 24, 1911.
The miracle at Truro. T.G. Beadle recently wrote a letter to Mark Fitzgerald of Truro, Iowa, questioning him as to the truth of the newspaper articles in regards to his miraculous healing and visit to heaven some time since. Yesterday, Mr. Beadle received a reply from Mr. Fitzgerald's daughter, giving an account of what her father claims to have experienced during his brief stay in heaven, and of his promise to the Lord to do his work until the end of his life. She stated that her father had been quite poorly with dropsy, his limbs being badly swollen, but was instantly and permanently healed. She also said that they had received many letters from all over the country in regard to the miracle.
This second one comes to us from the Hattiesburg News, dated January 10, 1911, and has a bit of a humorous twist to it.
It has now been proved that one man thinks Iowa is a better place than heaven, although so many people preferred the Canadian Northwest to Iowa that the state lost population during the last decade. Mark Fitzgerald, a farmer living near Truro, Iowa, claims he has been raised from the dead. He declares that while his soul was in heaven, He promised the Lord that if permitted to return to earth, he would devote his entire time to religious work. He is selling his livestock and preparing to carry out the bargain. Fitzgerald is old, prominent, and wealthy. We believe he is also a little crazy, or he would have stayed in heaven when he was there. If he had been from Mississippi and wanted to come back, there would have been some excuse for him. A Mississippian can scarcely improve his condition by dying, and not at all by moving out of the state.
I was able to find several of Mr. Fitzgerald's accounts confined mostly to small Southern and Midwestern newspapers. They all referred to Mr. Fitzgerald as Mark Fitzgerald. In essence, the articles were about the same, some identical to each other. This is common in the newspaper business. For this particular case, though, one paper described Mr. Fitzgerald as age 35, one 40, and one calling him old. Digging a bit deeper, through exhaustive research, I was able to uncover this mystery. It turns out that Mr. Fitzgerald was actually a 51-year-old husband and father of 10 children. Here's the kicker: his name wasn't even Mark, it was James Martin Fitzgerald, who went by Martin. They got the first 3 letters right anyhow. I'd like to share one more article, and then I will wrap this up. This one comes from the Waterloo Evening Courier, Waterloo, Black Hawk County, Iowa, dated February 28, 1911.
Man saw heaven, now builds tabernacle. Martin Fitzgerald, the Madison County man who claims to have seen heaven during a recent illness and who was sent back to this world by the Lord in answer to the prayers of his friends, so he claims, is now trying to raise money by subscription to buy a tabernacle to fulfill the promise he made the Lord that he would devote his life henceforth to the good of humanity. He says he finds the most opposition in doing this comes from the ministers who seem not to want him to use their churches in which to speak and tell his experience in heaven, and the Lord has told him to buy a tabernacle.
That is the end of the articles I could find on Martin. It's amazing that then as now, clergy and religious people in general resist putting any credence into these NDEs. I think that is starting to change though. Anyway, Martin Fitzgerald would only live another 7 years before dying permanently in 1918 at age 59. I could not find a cause of death, nor could I find out if his tabernacle was ever built. One interesting side note is that Martin's father was Reverend Edward Fitzgerald, who died in 1912, just a little over a year after his son's NDE. I wonder what he thought of Martin's experience. How do you think this story compares to modern NDEs? Leave all comments below, and thank you for listening. If you liked today's story, please leave me a thumbs up.